So we're talking about dependent origination. We gave a summary of the early Buddhist texts. We talked about how the dependent origination is a central aspect of dependent origin of the early Buddhist texts, and how it has, as a very rich teaching, is very intimately bound with the Four Noble Truths and with the fundamental teachings of the Buddha. We talked about some of the myths about dependent origination. We discussed conditionality, both in the abstract and about how it's applied in the particular context of dependent origination. Then we began by looking at the different factors of dependent origination, and we looked at ignorance, we looked at that's avijja, we looked at sankharas, its choices, and we looked at consciousness, which is vijnana, and we looked at different aspects of these things, and also, to some extent, at the relationship between them and how they sort of work, because dependent origination is not just a list of things, but it implies a complex set of relationships between those things, and that will emerge even more so with this link, which is the nama rupa. But so rupa literally means basically it's talking about the physical realm. So yes, it certainly includes the sense stimuli, 5 senses, yep, and also sometimes the 6th sense. Yes, but rupa, the literal meaning of rupa is form, okay, or shape. Yeah, that's the basic meaning of it. And one of the things about rupa is that as a word, it went on a bit of a journey. And so the way that it went from where it started to where it landed up is quite a long and interesting tale. So it's one of the things that we have to remember with when we're dealing with languages and we're dealing with words, is that they don't have fixed meanings, but they have meanings that evolve and change over time. And that evolution did not somehow stop 2,500 years ago with the suttas. The words continue to evolve and change over time to the present day, and they still continue to change in the present day. So when we look at words, we always have to look at how they're used in context and what is the meaning in that place, and then we can start to ask, well, what does that mean for us here and now? So rupa, form, physical realm, materiality, shape. What are some other renderings of rupa around the place? Just matter, body. Sometimes rupa just means body. In fact, in dependent origination, it's actually close in meaning to body, actually, isn't it? Yeah. And nama. What's nama? Name, yes, so you're offering a definition of nama, yes, so there's a definition of nama, but the word itself has a meaning of name, that's correct, and of course that's actually fairly easy because it's actually the same as the English word name, and in fact right over the world, from Ireland all the way to Indonesia, the word nama still means name. It's a very popular word, yes. Okay. So far we've got the basic meaning of it, but what's it getting at? Like, what's the point of this idea of nama rupa? Yes. Can I just see for 1 minute your desktop there? Your desco topo. Yes, okay, so we can see Venerable Brahmali's desktop. Now, I'm not meaning to shame the amount of stuff that he's got on his desktop. It's not what I'm doing here. I'm not doing that. That's not the purpose of this, okay? Come back.
Come back?
Yes.
I have to follow orders, don't I?
Yes, that's correct, yes. Okay, so here we are. So here on this Desco Topo, we have a bunch of icons with labels. You see? Name and form. The icon is a shape, and the label is a name. This is name and form, a bunch of different names and forms. Yeah. Now, this is interesting because this seems to kind of latch in somehow to how the human mind, that if we have something organized in this kind of way with an image and a label attached to it, that somehow we recognize it better If you were to just have images on there, it wouldn't work all that well. Or if you were to just have labels, it would just look like a mass of text. But when you have the image and the label, it helps you to recognize things and remember things. It's something which seems to be fairly hardwired into how the human mind works. So similarly, we saw, and this goes back a long way, we saw earlier, we discussed briefly the Bible, and yes, you can, but you see here, more names and forms there on the Google sidebar, everywhere, right? And there's a reason for that, right? So in the Bible, of course, all the animals, they have a name and form, right? So God goes around the Garden of Eden and is labeling all of the animals, right? You're a frog, you're a turtle, you're a kangaroo. Greek is Noma, yeah, Greek is Noma. You're a Tyrannosaurus Rex. You're a cockroach?
Me, or is it...
No, just generally.
Okay.
You, Venerable Sir, are a lion.
I'm a lion? Okay.
Yeah, but a very gentle vegetarian lion. Yeah. Who only cares for other lions. Who got started with this? Okay. No, aren't you a dragon? You're a dragon. I think you're a dragon.
Some people... whatever. Yeah,
let's move on.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the point is we have names and we have forms. And this latches into somehow some way that the human mind works. And think about things like, say, if you're going for a walk through a forest and you see a kind of tree, I don't know what that is. And then you have a friend with you who knows about it and says, oh, that's a such and such tree. And you're like, oh, okay, now I know what it is. And when you learn something like that, what you're doing is you're in your mind, in its way, you're sticking a label on a form. You're sticking a nama on a rupa. It's what the mind does. You put a nama on a rupa, and you say, oh, and then you think, oh, I know that. Yeah. I mean, you still don't know that much about it, but at least you have starting to know that. Now, this association, and what happens then is that you feel pleasure. You feel pleasure. And think about again how a child grows up. And as a child grows up, they learn languages, so they're learning all of these names for all of these things. And so they get these sense of concepts, these sense of things that they perceive, and the world becomes more comprehensible because they have names for them. And names lend a certain persistence to things and a certain identity to things. If I know this is my mum, then it's the same person. She goes out of the room and then she comes back in, and I didn't see her in between that, but now I see her and she's the same person. Okay? So even though the rupa, the form, has vanished, but the name persists. Yeah? And this is how we have a sense of self-identity as we grow and grow old. Yeah? Even though I've grown and I've changed, my rupa has changed, but my nama is still the same. So you can see that these ideas of permanence and self start to creep in when we start to give things names. Now, that's not to say it's a bad thing. I mean, we have to do it. That's how we organize the world and understand the world. But then it just becomes a little bit, carries that implication. Now, one of the interesting things about magic is that magic works on names and forms as well. So those of you who are aficionados of Harry Potter will know of He Who Must Not Be Named. Because saying the name of something can have a power. Can invoke that thing. And this is actually, when authors are doing these things, they're drawing on a range of quite widespread folk beliefs in different cultures around the world. And the association of a name with magical power is very widespread. There are many cultures who traditionally would never reveal your true name. You have an inner name that only you know, and maybe people you really trust, and then the outer name is used by everybody around. Because to know your true name then you can do a spell or you can do some magic and wield power over you because you know your true name. And so there's this tendency, and what this is all based on is this tendency to assume or to impute that the form, that there's an intrinsic or essential relationship between the name and the form. Yeah? That I have my own true name. So there's a name that goes with me essentially. And I might change my name. People might call me Sujato, but instead of calling me Anthony, which they did when I was younger. But that doesn't change the fact that my true name is still the same. And so when you get attached to that idea of the true name, then you start to fall into these traps of eternalism and so on and so forth. So this is one of the directions that the idea of the name and form can lead, and historically did lead. Now, again, returning to the historical situation in Buddhism in India before the time of the Buddha, then we've mentioned before about some of the great sages there who wrote the texts we know today as Upanishads, and who talked about the higher self as being the consciousness, the vijnana. So what they were saying was that yourself is not this and not that. Neti, neti, Ajahn most famous phrase, one of his most famous phrases, neti, neti, not that, not that. And it's not because of your body that the self is dear. It's not because of what you own. It's not because of your relationships. It's not because of all of these names and forms, all of the things of the world that you can see around you, that the self is dear. Again, according to this Upanishadic philosopher, but because of the Atman, which is pure consciousness. So what these sages were realizing, what they were trying to articulate, was that behind the show of the world, behind all of the diversity of the things that we see in the world, there is one unalterable reality. In Chinese philosophy, they say a similar thing. In Taoist philosophy, first is the Tao, and then the Tao splits into yin and yang, and then from there you have the 10,000 things. And that 10,000 things is the nama rupa. It's all of the differentiated forms of the world. So according to the Upanishadic philosophy, the goal of our spiritual quest is to come back to that undifferentiated unity which underlies all of the apparent showings of this world, which we call nama rupa. And they will use similes for that. For example, one simile talks about all of the rivers which flow down from the land, and each of these rivers has its own name and its own shape, its own nama and its own rupa, just like each person in this room have your own name, your own form. But when those rivers pour down into the ocean, then there is only the one ocean, and that is the ocean of consciousness, which has the one taste. Now, again, as I've tried to sort of emphasize throughout this course, when we listen to these teachings, this is not a Buddhist teaching, and the Buddha would criticize this teaching. But at the same time, I can't help feeling there's something quite beautiful about that teaching. And there's something which is quite evocative and quite attractive about this kind of idea that we have these limited, arbitrary shells, and then we can all become one in that ocean. And that ocean is infinite and is eternal. Now, unfortunately, the Buddha was a bit of a killjoy. So he came along and he would say, well, the ocean actually isn't infinite and it's not eternal. The ocean will dry up. And the ocean also is part of that cycle. We know that now, don't we? We know that the water from the rivers doesn't disappear when it goes into the ocean. It forms a part of the ecosystem of the ocean, then eventually it will evaporate, form into clouds, come back, rain on the land, and the ocean is in fact feeding the rivers just as much as the rivers are feeding the ocean. So when we look from a limited point of view, it looks like the rivers are flowing down into the ocean, and it looks like a one-way flow down from the rivers to the ocean. But when we look at it more carefully and have a better understanding, we can see it's a cycle. And what we're glimpsing at is really just parts of this cycle that we can see. And the ocean conditions the rivers, just as the rivers condition the ocean, and these are all part of that cycle. And that's very much the kind of insight that the Buddha brought to this teaching on consciousness and name and form. So consciousness, Vijnana and Namarupa is quite a prominent part of that Brahmanical philosophy, and it's mentioned frequently in cases where the Buddha is in dialogue with Brahmins, especially with those Brahmins who are very kind of advanced practitioners and very learned scholars or meditators. And these are questions that they would bring up very frequently. So this is one of the reasons why, when we look at this particular set of Dhammas from a modern perspective, that it can often seem it's a bit obscure, it's a bit hard to get hold of exactly what the Buddha was talking about. But there's a reason for that. He was speaking directly to a quite specific set of concerns, but one which is, when we understand it, is still, I think, powerfully relevant for today. Now, what the Buddha did then is that the Buddha then responded to that understanding of Nama-Rupa with his own analysis. And sometimes the Buddha used a strategy of deconstruction or analysis. So he would say, this thing that you think of as being one thing actually is many different things, right? And so that's what he did in this case of Nama-Rupa. And he said, well, when we look at form, right, what we take to be our bodies or the forms in the world, the 10,000 things in the world, they look like they're unitary things. They look like they're objects. But if you analyze them and break them down, what you find is that they're all made up of the four elements. Yeah? And so that unitary thing that we think of as a form, in fact, is no such thing. And similarly with name, with nama, okay, we think that something is a unitary thing. But the Buddha said, actually, if you see how the mind works when it's naming things, then there's a variety of mental processes that are going on and that are essential for that process of naming. And this was what you were mentioning before when the Buddha was analysing nama into intention, attention, and so on, these different mental factors, which we'll go into more a bit later on. So he's responding to that idea and saying, let's break it down so we can understand how the mind names things. Yeah? And how the mind how the mind works, because naming things is not something which is just trivial. Think about how much of your mental activity is linguistic, how much time you spend thinking about things, how your categorization of things and people will affect you and your emotions and your choices and everything that you do. So that process of learning how to name things and categorize things is intrinsic to how the mind works, especially that aspect of intelligence and cognition in the mind. And then that is one of the reasons why we sometimes get these different translations of Nama-Rupa, and it's a particularly tricky one to translate. The literal meaning, name and form, is the meaning that we usually come back to. It's a bit obscure by itself. It doesn't really mean much until you've had a bit of background and learning on it. You sort of look at it and go, what's it talking about? Then you can try to explain it more. Some people will say, Bhikkhu Bodhi for a while used mentality and materiality. Yeah? Or you could say psychological and mental phenomena, or psychological, thank you, psychophysical phenomena, different kinds of things. And so it's because all of these translations actually are fine, but they're all sort of teasing out a different kind of aspect to a very rich term. Sometimes nama is translated as mind and body, which again is a tempting translation, but it's not a particularly accurate one because mind should include vijnana, but vijnana is not there as part of nama. So that's one thing. And also rupa, yes, in some cases it does mean body, as we'll see later on, but it also includes the things which we perceive, the senses around us, objects of five senses. Rupa, interestingly enough, also includes some things that we can perceive purely with the mind. It's not just five senses. Yeah? So rupa means the quality of things that have a physical quality or property. For example, colour. So if you imagine the colour red, then that's a rupa, which appears in your mind. Yeah? If you imagine two things apart from each other in your mind, say a horse riding towards a house, then there's a property of distance there. And distance is also a physical property. It's not literal distance in the physical sense, but it's a similar kind of thing. And so the idea of, in your mind, if a light appears in meditation, right, you're meditating, and mind becomes peaceful, and light appears. Oh my goodness! Yeah? This is in Pali. This is called a rupa. Yeah? It's a form that appears to your mind. So so rupa doesn't just include objects of the five senses, but also includes objects of the sixth sense, or the mind, that have some kind of physical property. Okay. So shall we? What's next? What do we got next? Do you want to do some?
Yeah.
Some stuff?
So this is the So this is just the basic conditioning process between consciousness and name and form. Yeah. So this is what we have at the very first slide here. Now this is the third and the fourth factor of dependent origination. Yeah. So there's many ways in which these things condition each other, and to understand those ways, and some of the philosophical background what Bhante Sujato has been telling is almost required to understand why it is phrased in this way. And we'll look at this later on, but it's also conditioned in certain ways that are very obvious. Yesterday we talked about the idea that consciousness is stationed, has a certain station, it has like a level in a sense, and that level will be the quality of your consciousness. Yeah, it can be bright, it can be dark, it can be in the intermediate, and that level will tend to be fairly stable. Okay, you get upset sometimes and it kind of gets you out of whack, but you come back to a kind of ground level where your consciousness tends to hang out, and that is the vijnana titi, the station of that consciousness. And so when you get reborn somewhere, because you get reborn according to that station of consciousness that you have developed through a lifetime, then in that next life there will be a limit to the kind of experiences you will have according to that station of consciousness. So if you get reborn in the human realm, you can expect to have roughly human experiences. So nama rupa will have a certain limits on them, which would be like the limits of things as they are in the human realm. If you get reborn as a cockroach, then you have cockroach experiences, and since we're on the topic of cockroaches, or we were, or if you get reborn as a dragon, can you get reborn as a dragon? Maybe you can,
Cockroaches are very dear to the heart of Sydney-siders.
Are they? Really? Okay. Why is that?
There's a lot of them.
There's a lot of them, okay. So the name and form, these are mental and physical phenomena. These are all the experiences of the mind apart from the consciousness itself. Those will be limited according to where you get reborn. So in the human realm, you can expect human experiences, which is the whole range of suffering and dukkha that we have, the way we perceive the world, individuated, separate people, with the kind of things that we desire. This is the sankhara aspect of the human realm. We desire certain things, human food, and these kind of things, and we live within that realm of humanity. If you get reborn in the Deva Loka, someone asked yesterday whether the Devas are real, and I said definitely they are real. But if you get reborn in the Deva Loka, well then your name and form will have a different range, different range of phenomena that you can expect to experience in that particular realm. So it is the experiences, the range of experiences you can expect while you are in that life. And then when you move from one life to the next one, that is where the range can make a certain change, because suddenly you get reborn in a different realm, and suddenly the range is dramatically different because you move from being a human to being a kangaroo. Kangaroo experience the world quite differently from humans. I don't know, we live in nature. Yeah, I live in Buddhist monastery in Perth, and we live almost on top of the kangaroos. We see them all the time. We know what they are like. And I wouldn't recommend to be reborn as a kangaroo. They may look kind of cuddly from a distance, but they're not all that cuddly when you know when you know them well. I'm sure you know what I mean. So this is the general idea of name and form. Yeah, how they interact, especially across one life to the next one, how that functions. So this is like I said yesterday, consciousness has a certain station, and a certain station means that it has a particular inclination. It inclines towards something, and then that inclination will then be the rebirth that you have. And what exactly is that station of consciousness? And one of the interesting things about this is that you can actually know your own station of consciousness by introspection. What does your mind incline towards? This is not a perfect science by any means, but it gives us some idea what is your inclination. Especially when you go on a meditation retreat. You get rid of the superficial stress of ordinary life, the restlessness of the mind, you get rid of some of the tiredness of the mind. And then what remains, in a sense, when you get rid of the superficial things, that what remains then, where your mind tends to go. You sit down, you close your eyes. What does your mind want to do when you sit down and close your eyes? You want to are you thinking a lot about the worldly things? Are you thinking about your family, your work? What are you going to enjoy when you come off the retreat? These terrible 8 precepts, these are a real hassle. But when I get back home, I'm going to make this kind of food. I'm going to watch these kind of movies. And this is actually taken from the suttas. This may sound like a joke, but this is actually taken from the suttas. This is a teaching that the Buddha gave to Lady Visakha. Lady Visakha, one of his main female disciples. And he tells her about what kind of uposatha, the uposatha, the observance day on the full moon day, is fruitful and what is not. And the not fruitful observance day is when you kind of sit down and think, I'm going to eat this, I'm going to enjoy that when I get back home. That's not considered, not very useful. But if you have metta towards the 4 directions, and then it's a good uposatha day. So you can see where your consciousness leans by kind of see where it tends to head. Other times you may find your consciousness tends towards peace. You're not interested so much in the worldly things. You don't think about those. Instead, your mind naturally leans towards peace. You enjoy the quietness of the mind. And then you know that your consciousness is stationed at a higher level. It is not so attached to the sensory world anymore. It's starting to release from the sensory world and goes to a higher level. And then consciousness can become very high, like in the deep samadhi states, and your mind is inclining towards jhana even, towards these powerful things, and that's where it tends to go. Or your mind can be very coarse and dark while inclining to sensory things. Maybe you can have some violent thoughts even, and then it is really heading towards the lower realms in that particular case. So you can have a rough idea of your own station of consciousness, and it will give you an idea where your mind is kind of heading. This is not absolute, because the idea of karma is probably quite a bit more complex than that. There are things that happen in the dying process you cannot kind of fully replicate in ordinary consciousness, but I think it is a fairly good replication, or will give you a fairly good idea of what is happening here. So that is how you know the station of consciousness. And then the rebirth fixes the aspects of personality. By aspects of personality, I mean nama rupa. They are fixed for that lifetime. You become, you are recognizable over a lifetime, or the breadth, the scope of your experiences is limited. So now we come back to what Bhante Sujato was talking about. What is name and form? And this is the basic definition found in the suttas. And it is kind of mysterious, the idea, why does the Buddha use such a strange compound, name and form? Name and form as a compound is only found in dependent origination. It's not found anywhere else in the suttas, I believe. I think it's pretty much the only place.
I mean, it's found a couple of places where just by itself, like what is the two nama to rupancha?
Like in some verses and things like that. But
generally speaking, let me see if I can refute that.
Okay.
There's a few cases where, say, the Solasapanha.
In the Paryanavagga. Okay,
But generally speaking, it's not. It doesn't feature in any. It certainly doesn't feature in any other major doctrinal context.
I think yeah. So so it is a bit in that sense. It's kind of a bit strange, and it's very very hard to kind of pin it down, and that's where you have to ask yourself the question: why did the Buddha use it? And this is kind of one of the points that Bhante Sujato is mentioning. He uses it because it is he wants to refer to the teachings of Brahmanism at the time, kind of to make a counterpoint to the Brahmanical teachings, and applying these terms in a new way and showing what they really mean. So for that reason, they are defined in the sutta as in very Buddhist ways, and so that even though they have a background which is very interesting to understand and to relate to, at the same time you want to invest these terms with a Buddhist understanding and a Buddhist way of looking at things. So this is how it is defined this is the Mahanidana Sutta, Digha 15, where you find this definition. And you see here the 3 of the 5 khandhas, form, rupa, feeling, vedana, perception, sanya. These are 3 of the 5. Vijnana, consciousness, is missing, and the reason why consciousness is missing is because consciousness is the condition for name and form, so it has kind of priors. That's why it cannot be part of that. It could be, but it makes better sense if it is not part of it. The other thing which is missing here is sankhara. What happened to sankhara? Shouldn't there be sankhara in there? Someone has stolen sankhara, taken it out. Some evil monastic maybe someone wanted to trick us. No, but that actually is not the case at all. The reason why sankhara is missing is because sankhara here comes in a different guise, in a different way. So these are the next 3 factors that define name and form. These are intention, contact, and attention. Cetana, passa, manasikara. And these 3 words, they are, in a sense, just a particular way of thinking about sankhara. Sankhara is, as we said yesterday, they are choices, or they can be called willed activities, etc. And all of these are part of those sankharas. These are also willed activities. Intention is the will in action. Contact is a little bit more uncertain, but certainly attention is also, you attend to something. You turn your mind towards something. You turn your mind towards the coffee, craving arises. You know that what happens? So it's very kind to offer me coffee because craving arises, and then upadana, taking it up, and then so you can see, it's interesting, right? And this is one of the things about the Buddhist teachings. You always have to bring it back to your lived experience. That's when it becomes kind of useful. And I think this is one of the problems in Buddhism, is very often we end up being too theoretical about things, but things are supposed to be referred back to your lived experience. In the more powerfully they are referred to your lived experience, the more real these teachings become. They become very strong if you can refer to them in how you live your life. So anyway, so you have these 3 words here for sankhara. It's an alternative way of thinking about sankhara. So why does the Buddha do this? Why does he say this? This is one of those very important questions, is the word why. You can never ask too much why with these things, because everything has a reason usually. And every time you ask why, you can go deeper into these teachings and understand what they are about. So why does the Buddha use these 3 words rather than just using good old sankhara, which he has everywhere else? And the way to answer these questions is very often to understand the context. And the context of this sutta makes it quite clear why he uses these particular words. And the reason is because this is the Digha Nikaya 15, I said this sutta, but there's no sutta mentioned here, but this is the Mahanidana Sutta. He goes on to show how the experience of the world happens. It happens, and these 3 things here are core ways of showing the experiential process, how it arises in the world. Especially attention and contact here are very important. Intention has probably been added to make it more complete. But contact and attention are 2 factors that come out of the sutta later on. And this is why I think it is divided up in this way, to show a more detailed exposition of the idea of sankhara. So this is how it is defined in the suttas. So why name and form, yeah? And this is what Ajahn Sujato was talking about just before, the Vedic connection. So, so in the Vedic connection, you have the consciousness, which is sometimes regarded as the self, yeah? And it is kind of one of the most natural places to find the self. Yeah? You know why that is? Why do you think consciousness is the most natural place to have the sense of self? And yes, so
because it's sneaky.
It's sneaky. Okay, that's really good. That's a very good reason. But that's true, probably. It's sneaky. It kind of slithers away as soon as you try to hold on to it. It kind of yeah. So that's very true. So the reason is because it is, in the end, it's possible to see almost everything in life as non-self. You can see how your feelings are always changing, your perceptions are changing, your will may even come and go, yeah, there are times when the will isn't really there. But there's one thing that seems to underlie everything, and that is awareness consciousness. It seems to be the most fundamental aspect of what it means to be a human being. We are conscious, we are aware of things. And that is why this is the most natural place to see a self. Yeah, when you strip away everything else, if there's anything that deserves to be called a self, it would usually be consciousness. So this is kind of the Vedic connection here with the Vedas also. I'm not sure. I don't know much about the Vedas, but we saw at least one passage the other day where the Atman was identified with consciousness. Yeah, and then. This is not exactly what Bhante Sujato was saying, but then the Atman creates itself, yeah, and the part of that creation of self is then the entry into name and form. So you create the world, and then you enter name and form, and by doing that, you're kind of expanding your self-identity. It's a bit like what we do as well in life. Yeah, we're always trying to find identity, and that identity that we have as anyone really, human beings, is always related to those khandhas. Yeah, it is always some way that nama rupa. We have a name. I name you like this, and what your name? You're a Buddhist. Yeah, bang, you have named you, and then at that moment you have that identity. You're a Buddhist. Yeah, you wear funny robes, and you have a shaven head. Okay, you must be a monk or maybe a nun. Yeah, because of the you look strange. And so then you are Buddhist monk, yeah, identity in this way. So the Atman, the sense of self, takes on these aspects of the world. So you enter in the Vedas, that is then called the Atman enters name and form. It's probably there. There's a bit more, what is it? A bit more kind of parables and all kind of things around this. It shows you how this works. But that's kind of the basic idea. And the Buddha then wants to criticize all of this. Yeah, that's kind of why he brings this in here. The Atman identifies with the name and form. That's when you take that identity on her. And so that is one of the, important reasons why the Buddha uses it, because he wants to critique this idea of the Brahmanical tradition. Yeah? He wants to show why it is false. And in part, that is showing why Vijnana is not actually the self. Yeah? Even consciousness cannot be a self. This is what he wants to show. And also, probably, he wants to show why name and form, too, cannot be a self. Yeah? Name tends to then, as we heard just before, name tends to kind of be a solid identity. But that identity, too, turns out to be false. This is not enough reason for Buddha to use the word name and form. There must be other reason. It is not enough to critique an existing teaching. There must also be a reason that actually relates to Buddhism itself. Yeah? And that particular reason is found in this Mahanidana Sutta.
Can I speak?
Please,
yeah.
your turn.
That's a really good point, Venerable, and I think that's one thing that sometimes it's very easy to forget, that being a critical or deconstructive teacher or philosopher is actually not all that hard, right? Because when you're dealing with spiritual things and philosophical things, you can take apart somebody else's ideas fairly easily if you want to, usually. Yeah. But to actually build it and to see, and I think that the Buddha was at the one time critiquing these ideas, but also he's saying, well, there's something in that we can build something out of.
That's right.
And then he was taking it forward, so he was a constructive teacher as well.
Yeah.
One thing that I'm just noticing, I'm just briefly searching through that question. I hadn't really thought about that, about nama rupa being found only in the context of dependent origination. And what I'm noticing going through here is that overwhelmingly yes, it appears in dependent origination, it appears in one or two other small passages, but for the vast majority of other cases it appears in verses.
Right.
Which is interesting because verses are the literary form in the Buddhist text which is the most closely derived from the Brahmanical tradition. And we tend to find that in the verses, the Buddha is addressing Brahmins or Brahmanical ideas more commonly than in the prose text. And so, yeah, interestingly that Namarupa occurs far more often in verses than it does in prose, apart from dependent origination.
And it also occurs in verses that where he speaks to Brahmins, right?
Absolutely does, yeah.
And often scholarly inclined Brahmins.
That's right, yeah, at quite a high kind of level. I mean, you have things like, say, in the Dhammapada, you have sabbaso nama rupasming yasanati mamayitang asatana chasochati save bhikkhuti vichati. So for all kinds of nama rupa, whoever has no sense of attachment, no sense of belongs to me, and who has no... does not grieve when things disappear. That's what I call a true bhikkhu.
Yeah. Okay. But I'd just like to just very briefly address that. I think it's a very important point. But to remember that one of the things about the Buddhist teachings that ultimately it is about insight. Yeah. So it is about kind of overturning your ordinary worldview. So you cannot really expect to understand these things fully. Yeah. You can only expect to have a certain enough understanding to drive you on in the right direction. So eventually you will uncover these things. And the main thing that blocks you from seeing anyone from seeing these things is the sense of self. The sense of self protects itself. It does. This is the kind of the problem with the sense of self. And because it protects itself, you cannot see these things fully as long as you have that sense of self there. This is part of the problem. So sometimes it's better to just approximate to these truths and just to realize that, in meditation, for example, when you feel peaceful, you feel better. Less identity is better. And that gives you a sense of direction as to why getting rid of things and seeing things as non-self is a positive thing, experientially a positive thing, and eventually down the track, see where that leads you. Something like that. Yeah. Would you like to... Should I talk? Or
Sorry, which one where?
I'm just going to talk a little bit about Diga 15 and the two kinds of contact. Just very briefly, just to show how it fits. It's not just a counter to the Vedic, but it's also it has a purpose in Diga Nikaya 15.
Adivachana Sampasa.
Yeah, Adivachana and the Patika Sampasa. Yeah.
And you're going to do that before you do the Animanya Pacha?
Yes, because we're talking about name and form. We're talking about the purpose of name and form. So I just wanted to talk about that very briefly before we do Anumanapacha.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah? Okay, so I'll talk about that and you can go on to the... Yeah.
No, you do that.
Yeah. So, as I was saying, the reason why the Buddha uses Namarupa is not just as a reaction to the Vedic teachings and the Brahmanism, to show that the ideas that were current at that time were not really adequate. You needed to go deeper, but it's also he uses Namarupa in his own system to show something specific, in context of dependent origination. So the sutta that we're looking at here is called the Mahanidana Sutta, the Great Discourse on Causation, and it doesn't start off with with avidya and sankhara, with ignorance and choices. It has taken out those two factors, and it also takes out the factors of the six senses. You can see that the sal ayatana. These are the six senses, or the six sense fields, actually, it should really be here. Because it's not just the senses, it's also the experience, the things that you experience through those six senses. That is taken out, So there's a direct relationship here. It goes straight from Namarupa to contact, And of course, whenever the Buddha does this, whenever he kind of skips a link like that, it's for a particular purpose. This is not random. This is has a very, very obvious purpose. And the rest of the sutta explains to us what is going on here. So let's have a quick look at this to see why. What is the purpose of this? So this is you can see the difference here between the two kinds of sequence. One goes straight from name and form to contact. The other one is from the six sense spheres to contact. That is the difference there. So why? What is this all about? Nama rupa, relation to contact, it goes straight from one to the next one. So the way the Buddha analyzes this, he says that contact really it has two aspects to it, for there to be contact. And one is what he calls the impact contact, known as the patiga sampassa in Pali. And that is almost like, when you see something, there's an impact, there's an imprint happening on your sense object, and sometimes it's kind of dramatic like this, and otherwise it's kind of more, so this is the impact contact, There's something happening in your senses. But that is not all there is to contact. There is more to it, Or you hear something, The hearing impact on your hearing, you touch something, Or even mentally, whenever you have a thought, that is called then the mental contact in the mind. But there's more to contact than that, and this is quite interesting, because the other kind of contact is called the adivachana sampassa. And you can call that the naming contact. This is the labeling that we were talking about before, the little files on the computer, the desktop. The label Mount Franklin is one of those naming contacts. And that is the mind working on the object, deciding what the object is. And not only deciding what the object is, but actually having a feeling about the object, perceiving it. The naming very often is not just the fact of giving something a name, but it's having a perception about something, which includes all the ways in which we identify something. A human being is a certain perception, A chair is a particular perception. You don't actually have to name, you will still be able to see it as a chair as a consequence. So there's these two aspects when we contact the world. There is the impact on the senses, and then there's the mind working on that impact and then making something out of it, Making it into a chair, a carpet, a room, a hotel. Buddhist people, all of these kind of things, friends, enemies. Enemies are the ones outside the door, or not, actually maybe not. I'm being too kind of divisive here. And that in itself is very interesting, because what that means is that when we experience the world through our senses, it is not a given. The world is not a given thing. The world depends on our interpretation, how we actually deal with that, our mental content. And that is why. So when I see someone, I see someone as a friend. I see Bhante Sujato as a friend. But tomorrow, I might see you as an enemy. No, I don't think that's very likely. I'm just saying I might. This is very, very, very unlikely. But it is possible. Things turn around sometimes very, very fast. But we have kind of functioned reasonably well for 25 years, so the likelihood of being suddenly enemies tomorrow is probably not all that great. But uncertain. So that is actually a very positive thing, because it shows you that if the world is a given thing, there's a very limited possibility for development. You cannot really change things very much. But the fact that the way that we see the world is actually mediated by the mind is what decides how we deal with the things that come through our senses, means that we can change things around. We can see, like, this room here can be ugly, or it can be beautiful, or it can be neutral. If you are really depressed, you come into this room, then it's going to look dark and negative and unpleasant. People are going to feel like your enemies if you're depressed, maybe, sometimes. But if you are happy, you come out of a good meditation, you feel bright, think, wow, this room is so beautiful. Even if it's just an ordinary room, really Bob-standard, boring room, still it looks beautiful. It's like those, in the suttas about the people who come out of a jhana experience. And when you come out of a jhana, the most ordinary food, the broken rice and porridge, I think they call it in the suttas. I'm not sure what broken rice is, but I guess it's not kind of whole grains or something like that. That tastes like the king's food, the king's meal, with sauces and curries and all kind of things. Like the food we get on Pindabata when we go around here. It's like the king's food. Anyway, but that's maybe the wrong thing to talk about now. Just to give you an idea, right? So it is our mental attitude to the world matters so enormously, and there's a massive potential for change, for how we deal with people around us, for seeing people in the right way. This is one of the great things that you see in the suttas, how to deal with anger, for example. Yeah, anger very often has to do with how we look at other people, how to change our perceptions so that we don't get angry with anyone anymore. This is one of those fundamental things on the Buddhist path. We cannot really afford to have enemies. Yeah, the moment you have an enemy in your life, well, you are holding yourself back. You're blocking yourself from having success in your meditation practice. Yeah, so this gives us this opening. All we have to do is to change our attitude, change our perception. And as we do that, the whole world changes accordingly. The people around us, how we relate to the sensory objects of the world, everything changes around us. And I think this is one of those reasons why the Buddha makes this distinction here between these two kinds of contact. Is there any other reason? What is your perspective on this, Bhante? Do you have any... would you like to add something to that?
No, really, I think it's good.
Yeah.
I think just the only thing I'd say is I think it's really interesting and quite sophisticated the way that the Buddha used the word patigha sampasa, especially we've translated as impact contact, impact or resistance or something like that. Yeah. And for the sense activity, because this is this kind of idea that, like, if you actually pay attention to your physical senses, they all do in fact require some kind of impact. Sound waves have to impact your ear to vibrate things. Right? Something has to actually touch you. There has to be some kind of physical something which affects something else. Whereas mental concepts don't work in the same kind of way.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah.
We had a kind of sophisticated understanding of things. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Anyway, I think now we are mutual conditionality of Namarupa.
Do you want to do this, or do you want me to do this?
I'd like you to do this.
You want me to do this?
Yeah.
Really? Okay. Okay. What's next? The next little slidette there. What do we have? All right. So in the standard dependent origination, we have more or less a linear sequence. One thing conditions another thing conditions another thing, like a row of dominoes or a Rube Goldberg machine, one of those things where you tip the ball and the ball rolls down and it rolls over something and a tap turns on and then a squirrel runs out of the hole and then, you know that?
What's that?
Rube Goldberg machine.
I don't really think about that. Okay.
Like if you get I put this down here and then this falls over, and when that falls over, then this sort of ball rolls along the thing, and then it falls off the edge, and then it tips this thing over, and it goes one of those things.
Right,
yeah.
Okay, yeah.
A Rube Goldberg machine. Anyway.
What's it called?
A Rube Goldberg machine. Yes. So this is how it's normally presented. Now, one of the things, of course, is that when the Buddha is presenting dependent origination, that he's presenting it using language. Language is a funny old thing because language exists in time. Right? You say one word and then you say the next word, and you're kind of limited by that. If you compare it, with Venerable Kaliko worked in the arts world, right? So in the arts world is not really limited by time in the same way. You have a picture and it just appears all at once. Whereas if you're a writer, you write one word after the next. And so even the word, as we were discussing earlier, the idea of the word Pali, like the Pali language, actually just originally means a line. So you're writing a line of words, one after the other. And so when you're putting things in a written context, the natural way of doing it is to write things as that kind of linear process. However, the world is not quite that simple. I don't know if you ever noticed that, but things are messy and they are frequently quite strange. Right? It's so weird. I mean, things just happen and you don't know why, and things kind of affect all different kinds of things and we don't know why. And conditionality is in fact complex and it's not linear. Now, all of this is something which is widely understood and widely accepted in the Buddhist traditions, and there is no Buddhist tradition that treats causality as a sort of simple and strict linear one, this, then that, then that, then that. All of the Buddhist traditions understand there, in fact, are multiple causes at play, and those multiple causes affect multiple things in multiple different ways, and there's all kinds of feedback loops and complexities and so on. And we've already seen that in a number of the different presentations that we've seen, where the Buddha will show the series of dependent origination in different ways, by taking different links out or putting them in a different order or something like that. And so the different kinds of relationships between things are complex and can't easily be reduced to a simple one-to-one causal relationship. So one of the interesting ways that the Buddha played around with this notion of the linearity, the straight lininess. This is the straight lininess. He played around with the straight lininess of things. Was when he, in the Mahanidana Sutta, and I think also Mahapadana Sutta, is that correct? No, that goes back to Namarupa, but doesn't loop, yeah. So Mahanidana Sutta is he then loops the whole thing, whoop, and then you go to loop with Namarupa and Vijnana. Consciousness and name and form. Name and form conditioned consciousness. Okay. Is there a specific condition for name and form? There is. What is the specific condition for name and form? Consciousness. Is there a specific condition for consciousness? There is. Name and form. So these two condition themselves. And so in this particular presentation, it actually just goes back to name and form and consciousness and doesn't continue back into the previous life with the avidya and the sankhara in the previous life. So this is very interesting because it shows us a sort of degree of complexity to what was, we've seen it presented in one way all of these times, and suddenly we see that there's actually a depth to it that we hadn't really noticed. And so this is essentially similar to the idea that I mentioned earlier of the ocean and the rivers pouring into the ocean evaporating, coming back into the rivers, and so on. And so name and form and consciousness are conditioning each other. And the Buddha gives an explanation for this in this sutta, in the Mahanidana Sutta, which I'm just coming up to. And here is the explanation. Yada, yada, yada. The Buddha did not say yada, yada, yada. Okay, so consciousness is a condition for name and form, and this is how to understand that. If consciousness were not conceived in the mother's womb, would name and form coagulate there? And the word I'm translating as coagulate is samutchissati, which is an unusual word, and that's what I think that it means. And sorry, I just lost the pace. And if consciousness after being conceived in the mother's womb were to be miscarried, would name and form be born into this state of existence? So here, obviously, we're talking about consciousness and name and form being the embryo, which might be conceived, but might not be carried through to term. And if the consciousness of a young boy or girl were to be cut off, would name and form achieve growth, increase, and maturity? No, it would not. So even after birth, then the consciousness can be cut off. If the child dies young, then there's no growth and there's no maturity there. Okay, so the idea here is that, where was I? Name and form. Right, so in this particular context, obviously what we've heard of as name and form clearly means just the body, it's just what's conceived, the embryo, the young child. And it's interesting that this passage acknowledges how risky this whole process is. That the process of pregnancy is very risky. The process of giving birth and the birth of a child is very risky. It's still risky today, and of course it was much more so in the Buddha's time. There was an article actually that came out in The Guardian just a little while ago, said that unprecedented scientific breakthrough realizes that we can't overcome old age.
Really?
Yes.
Really? Okay.
I didn't know if it was The Onion. I thought it was a joke title for a while, but no, apparently it was a real title. Unprecedented study shows that we can't overcome old age. And essentially what it shows is that the increase in our lifespan these days, the average lifespan, is basically almost all attributable to increased the survival of young babies and pregnancy. Yeah? And that's what actually is almost all of the increase. We haven't learned how to solve old age at all. We're just surviving pregnancy and early childhood better. Anyway, so this is how consciousness is conditioning name and form. So consciousness is arriving, as we've talked about before, and there's a conception, there's a new child, and then the child grows up, and so on. Okay. Name and form are conditions for consciousness. Okay, so this is this is how consciousness conditions name and form. But then, how does name and form condition consciousness? So this is the other side of the loop here. If consciousness were not to become established in name and form, would the coming to be of the origin of suffering, of rebirth, old age, and death in the future be found? No, sir. This is why this is the cause, source, origin, and condition of consciousness, namely name and form. So the point here is that it's now going from that process of rebirth and conception and growth in the womb and the growth of the early child to now looking forward, right? It's talking about the rebirth, old age, and death in the future. So what's going to happen in the next life? In a way, this sort of link is almost kind of leaping over all of the rest of the factors in dependent origination and going straight forward to rebirth at the end. So the point here is that this organic life, our body and all of this stuff, is also nurturing and conditioning our consciousness, which is what happens as we grow up. And we know this, right? We know that as we grow up, we become more conscious. We know things in different ways. We become aware of things, and that awareness of things is dependent on our body, because without eyes, we can't see things. Without ears, we can't hear things. It's dependent on our thoughts, it's dependent on our ideas, and all of those kinds of things. So all of those aspects of nama rupa will condition our consciousness and will allow our consciousness to grow up. And because of that, that means we're going to get reborn again next time. And it keeps on going around and round. So this is this idea that consciousness and nama rupa will condition each other. So, and the Buddha then goes on to make a very powerful and quite profound and I think quite moving statement, one of the most profound and moving statements I think in the whole of the Buddhist canon. This is the extent to which one may be reborn, grow old, die, pass away or reappear. This is how far the scope of language, terminology and description extends, how far the sphere of wisdom extends, how far the cycle of rebirth proceeds, so that this state of existence is to be found, namely name and form, together with consciousness. So no matter how far we look and no matter where we go and what we do, all we find is more name and form and consciousness. Anyamanya pachayata, yeah? Conditioning each other. Yeah?
So what that means, Bhante, is that when we see this name, form and consciousness, the mutual conditioning here, and we can assume, in a sense, this doesn't refer to a single lifetime. This just refers to basically time immemorial into the past.
Right.
It's kind of just life after life after life, which is
Etavata, right? Etavata, jayetava, jiyetava, miyetava. Yeah.
So when we're talking about dependent origination being like one or two lifetimes, actually it is just unlimited lifetimes in this particular case.
Right. Yeah. And I think I'm just looking at this. I haven't translated these last two words here. If you know, my translation says name and form together with consciousness. Yarirang nama rupang sahavinyanena. I think that this is a variant reading. I think this is just added in the slipped in from the commentary into the Burmese text. I think, yeah. I can check that out, but I think that's why I haven't translated that. Yeah. And like to me, like one of the things that's really that's really kind of striking in this Mahanidana presentation is how intrinsic the role of language is. Like the role of language is implicit in the whole idea of nama rupa, right? You have nama, which is a name of things, but in the Mahanidana Sutta, it's really emphasizing that you have the adivachana sampasa, and you have the niruti pato and the adivachana pato, and language, and how we form concepts with language, and how that shapes our views and ideas. It shapes our morality, it shapes our choices, and that's such a fundamental part of how consciousness is conditioned. It's not just, we tend to think of language almost as almost like a byproduct or a sort of an incidental thing that minds do, but actually it's much more fundamental than that. It shapes how the mind works. Yeah. Okay, so this is name and form and consciousness. Elsewhere, the Buddha talks about this in a couple of other contexts. There's another place where, do you have this one, the sheaf of reeds thing?
Well, we have a whole. Let's have a look what's coming next there. Oh, there we are.
There we go. Beautiful. So we got a lovely image there. Consciousness on the left, Nama Rupa on the right, and there they are, leaning up against each other. It's very beautiful. So that's nice.
Yeah, this is actually a sutta, right?
This is like exactly the image out of the suttas that talks about how these lean up against each other. I suppose they would do that to keep them dry, right? You lean them up against each other I guess. Anyway, that's what it's like, and that kind of image, it shows you something of the fragility of it. Right? That it's very easy to knock one over and then they all fall down. Yeah. So it's a state which has to be sustained, and it's sankharas, I guess, which sustain it, give the energy to sustain that.